Welcome to the rebellion.
I think Star Wars must be such an interesting challenge because it is a actual galaxy, right? There are all these planets, all these civilizations, but of course there is sort of a visual template that has been set. So when you talked to Tony as you were beginning work on this show, what were the conversations like about where he wanted to go visually with the costumes?
You're right. It's a real pleasure joining the Star Wars image making team when you sign on to a project like this. It's very important to do your homework and to look at the last 50 years of image making and canon, of the films, the graphic novels, the animation, how all of these characters have been portrayed over the years. And then with my talking with Tony Gilroy, we sort of talked a lot about sort of our take on the canon, what we wanted to tell with our story. It was very important to Tony for it to be a fully fledged drama. He saw this as a very adult story. It's very detailed. We were avoiding sort of cliches and tropes. We were thinking about our characters in a very detailed way. We wanted to portray them in a very grounded, fully fledged way, very visceral, authentic way. And so that's what I was thinking about when I was designing these characters. You do the research, but then at a certain point you need to lift off and do your own interpretation that suits your story and telling the story in the most surprising, compelling, and imaginative way. So that was our approach to the costumes for season two.
You have such an interesting thing here with Cassian himself because it's all leading to this sort of handoff to Rogue One. And that goes on all levels, including for you. So can you talk about Cassian as a character and basically the 5 years the show is set in, and it keeps jumping ahead, and how you sort of thought about showing that, how he's gonna move ahead, how his look will move ahead, aiming towards what we saw him wearing in Rogue One?
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the real pleasures of designing for Andor was this wonderful, 5-year arc that we showed. All of the characters are very different at the beginning to how they appear at the end. They go on an incredible sort of personal journeys. So that was wonderful to chart in such detail. I think there's 20 hours of storytelling with it between season one and season two. So we could really go very deeply into each corner of these people's worlds and how they express themselves in their costume over the years. So in the sense of Cassian, when we first meet him, he's kind of just a kid trying to work out who he is. He's sort of messing up, sort of disappointing friends. He's very undisciplined. And then by the end, you have him walking onto the tarmac on Yavin, an incredibly disciplined and focused member of the Rebel Alliance, off to his final mission, and looking extremely heroic. And so in season two, I think he has about 17 different costumes. He's sort of midpoint in his journey to becoming a hero. He takes on these different disguises that Luthen give him to carry out various missions on different planets of our galaxy. So he has different personas that he's achieving in a much more convincing way, I think, than season one, when we see him as the fashion designer on the planet Gorman. It's a Cassian that we've never seen before. It's an extremely polished, urbane, highly tailored, beautifully detailed Cassian. And that was lots of fun to explore with Diego, who was very excited about this whole different Cassian that we've never seen before. He also appears as two different types of journalists in season two on Gorman. He's a very sort of, world traveled, sort of field journalist, like someone who goes to all of the different crisis areas around the world, a war correspondent, fits in lots of different environments. In on Gorman, he wears a very sort of weathered linen trench coat that he could be comfortable in everywhere with, sort of cool leather detailing and sort of details that he appears very comfortable in. Then when he's a reporter on Coruscant, which is a very different planet that he wants to blend into, it's much more edgy. It's the ultimate metropolis. It's the sort of Washington, D.C. of the Star Wars universe. So he has to sort of go into the Senate and fit in there. So his disguise there is much more urban. It's sort of slicker. It's got kind of edgy Star Wars detailing to it. He has this more heroic trench coat that he wears that ends up on Mon Mothma as he extracts her from the Senate. So um, then we see him arrive on Yavin, and we see him over the years in Yavin, you know, develop towards his final Yavin look. One of the great pleasures of Andor season two is showing how soldiers arrive on Yavin in the years leading up to Rogue One, and how this disparate group of people arriving in clothing from all different parts of the galaxy forms together over the years, becomes more uniform. You can see how the uniforms of Rogue One develop out of the looks of these different soldiers and Rebel Alliance figures that are gathered on Yavin. So even with Cassian's clothing, it starts at a more individualistic kind of look of his shirting and his gilet and his clothing that we see on Yavin. And then that develops into a much more together, focused, the leather jacket, the beautiful look of Rogue One that we see as the final image. That's an interesting journey for him to chart on Yavin.
I'm so glad you mentioned the fact that Mon Mothma ends up wearing that one coat during the
Mhm.
Coruscant extraction, because that made me think about how when you read something like that, when you know, oh, well, Cassian's going to wear this coat, but then he's going to give it to Mon Mothma, so it has to be this sort of important piece of costuming for two of our main characters. Does that really make you think about, okay, how does it work visually for both these characters, even if it's something she's kind of wearing on the fly?
Absolutely. There's a lot of thinking that went into that. And it was one of those great kind of costume puzzles that I knew I had to tell that story of her becoming a rebel figure through the clothing. So we see her at the beginning of that sequence in her incredibly refined sculptural senatorial robes. She takes off the blue robe to become a little less formal, when she's escaping from the Senate. And then Cassian realizes that she has to disguise further and put his trench coat on. And so when they arrive at the safe house, there's a moment where you see her, with her ivory silk clothing from the Senate, then with a jacket over the top. And it's sort of this great visual image of her joining the rebellion movement. And I think Cassian
Mhm.
says to her at that moment, "Welcome to the rebellion." And it's sort of a moment where you really see her changing from this sophisticated senator to a much more grounded, heroic, one of the people, when we see her in Yavin after this, she's really done away with all of her senatorial finery, and she's become much more relaxed in her clothing, more functional, more utilitarian, a much more sort of yeah, highly functioning member of the Rebel Alliance. So creating this costume, the trench coat that had to work on both characters was something I really relished as a design challenge.
I feel like it must be such a fascinating thing with something like Mon Mothma because, this is a character we were introduced to in 1983 in a single scene wearing a particular costume. And now on this show, you're going to show a younger version of her and a fancier version of her, but you're also going to eventually meet more and more people that are also from Chandrila. So is it kind of that interesting sort of handoff as you take that one scene in Return of the Jedi and you kind of deconstruct it and expand upon it so that there can be some connective tissue between it all?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a great example of doing the research of a character and seeing how she's being portrayed over the years and taking an essence of those depictions of her. Like she's often worn wearing pale colors. She's often depicted wearing, so slightly draped clothing. She has this sort of what I call the chain of office. That's sort of an element that she's often wore, this sort of draped chain with a sort of Chandrilan emblem. So I take things like this and then I use them as sort of building blocks for how we're going to portray her in our story. And you're right, we go to Chandrila for I think the first time in Star Wars, and we really get a chance to explore that culture. One of the things that love about designing for Andor is this idea of world building. So with Chandrila, I worked a lot, and indeed with the other 9 planets that we go to in Andor season two, I work a lot with the production designer Luke Hull, and we really get into the nitty gritty of what these cultures are. We talk about what their belief systems are, what their resources are, what they build their, built environment and their clothing out of, what's a priority to them, what the climate's like, what their ancient traditions are like. So we really talk a lot about that, and so we can define and make distinct all of these different planets. So when it comes to Chandrila, um, what I wanted to portray then with the clothing is this ancient sense of tradition. Their clothing is quite restrictive. It's very formal. It's very precise layering of elements. And that was important for me because it really helped tell Mon Mothma's story. If she comes from this very formal traditional culture, then I wanted to feel her discomfort as she's sort of battling her inner demons. She has to keep up this sense of poise and elegance of this culture, but at the same time, she's has this very nerve-wracking situation. She has this double life. She's, using her incredible wealth and funneling funds into the Rebel Alliance, which is a huge secret. That if she it puts her loved ones and her family under incredible danger. So she really feels the pressure of her situation, and then the clothing helps tell this. It's architectural, it's layered, it's possibly uncomfortable in its restrictiveness. And so I wanted to see her pushing against that. There was a strength of how she showed herself with her Chandrila clothing, but also I wanted to have a sense of vulnerability. There's always an element of will the mask slip? So there's a softness of the pleating elements that sort of fluttered around her, beautiful sort of minimal tones, neutral tones of her clothing that sort of hinted at as perhaps a vulnerability, a humanity behind this sort of incredibly strong poise and elegance of the character.
And then, of course, another key figure here is Dedra. And Denise had a really lovely post on Instagram recently about your work on season two, showing us home life, Dedra, which, of course, it's a whole new thing. We never saw Grand Moff Tarkin go home in casual wear. Yeah, we can only imagine. Uh, so taking an Imperial officer and the rigidity that we know them for and the uniform we know them for, and so showing what do they wear when they go home? Was that something that was, something you were eager to jump into this season?
Absolutely. It was a wonderful design challenge for us to think about what does an Imperial officer wear when they go home? Do they change into their comfortable soft clothing and slippers and just kind of let it all hang out? Well, in Dedra's case, we thought, no, absolutely. Her world vision is so absolute. She lives in a world of black and white. There's no in between. There's no color in her world. So we decided that her at home clothes were as equally defined and minimal and severe as her uniform. She had sort of a uniform for her homeware as well. And so I created a series of costumes for her at home who were they had kind of razor sharp tailoring. They had very minimal detailing, sort of metallic clips and detailing across her costuming, very precise lines and architectural detailing to her clothing, which kind of reflected, I guess, a sort of a sort of a coldness, a lack of humanity. When you contrast it to all of the other characters in the Star Wars universe, the Rebel Alliance characters that show a wonderful sense of layering and textures and color and the beautiful spectrum of humanity. Her worldview is the very opposite to all of that. So I really enjoyed working with Denise and doing this very defined, fastidious, precise clothing for her.
I really love hearing you talk about how, you kind of have to get into the minds of your characters that you're costuming because it is something important about the choices they make. And I think Kleya is a notable one here because she obviously had a pretty expanded role this season, and we got to see her in more varied ways. And we even got to see her as a child and where she came from. So for something like that, where you'd established something for her for season one, but now you knew you were going to be building her out so much, what was sort of the approach you took with Kleya?
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about Claire because she's a really important figure in season two. I think she actually had the most costumes of all of my principal casts. Yeah, I think she had over 20 looks in season two.
Wow.
And that was great, sort of thinking about her character a little bit more deeply. Claire is an incredibly focused character. She sort of has this laser-like sort of focus on her mission. She's extremely serious, and she takes her role in supporting the Rebel Alliance very, very seriously. So I wanted to reflect that in her clothing. It's very minimal. She often wears the same thing every day at the when she's working at the gallery with Luthen. But and even her evening wear when she's Kleya is sort of a version of her daytime wear at the gallery. It's the sort of silk version of that she wears to the party in episode 6. But we also see her out and about gathering intelligence on mission in Coruscant. So she has lots of different disguises, where every time we see her, she has a different silhouette. When she breaks into the hospital in episode, I think 10 or 11, she becomes a nurse. She steals a nurse's uniform, and so I had to design a whole range of nurses and doctors and hospital worker uniforms for our hospital on Coruscant. So yeah, we see lots of different versions of her. She's a real chameleon, and we also including showing her as a young child, hooking up with Luthen at the very beginning of her journey, as a sort of a refugee from a planet that the Empire was tearing apart. Luthen sort of takes her up and sort of trains her in the art of the hustle and in the art of intelligence gathering, extracting information from people, you know, getting people's confidence so that they're comfortable in telling you their secrets. So we see her as this sort of, you know, um, bedraggled refugee child. And then as she works with Luthen, she gets more resources. She is able to put her look together a little bit more, so people are less wary of her. She comes across as a very, um, uh, yes, very trustworthy person that you'd want to spill your secrets to by the end. So that was a great costume journey to show with her character.
You want to spill your secrets to her, but you should be wary. With the with the cast, on a project like this, you got so much going on. You're developing so much, but as they start to see it themselves, start to do the fittings, is there some conversation, little tweaks that happen, maybe from things that they might suggest or might talk to you about their character with?
Absolutely. It's one of my important ways that I like working is it's the collaboration. I don't just design one thing, have one thing on the rail during the fitting, and that's what they're wearing. It's a real journey. I have a whole rail of things, different shapes to try on in the fitting, and I really enjoy listening to their take on things, how the different silhouettes and costumes make them feel, what they feel is appropriate, what is maybe they don't need to tell the story. So talking to the actors, talking to the directors, talking to the showrunners, talking to the producers, there's so much wonderful dialogue and thought that goes into all of the details of these characters. Nothing is accidental. It's all there for a reason.
I feel like it must be a fascinating thing for you to work on a project like Star Wars or your previous work on something like the DC films you did with Zack Snyder because they have a second life. As you see behind me, I'm a toy collector, so whether it be toys, sometimes those high-end hot toys, or cosplay, you will get to see your work replicated in different ways. Is that just sort of a really fun and maybe unexpected thing for you as you've gone further in your career?
It's an amazing thing for me, really, and it makes me want to be the best costume designer I can, knowing that these costumes have a second life beyond the project that I'm working for, that these characters are so important to people. It makes me want to just make them the best versions of the costumes that I can make them. I put so much thought into them. I really want them to be surprising and interesting and compelling for people to stew over the many years that these characters live on through cosplay and through merchandising and through figurines. So it's a wonderful sort of byproduct of my life as a costume designer.
Is there anything that stands out to you? I mean, you had so many things you're working on for Andor, but doing this second season, was there something that was like the biggest challenge, whether it be on the development side or the actual build of it, that was like, oh wow, we finally cracked that one.
I think it was just the sheer scale of this project, committing a year of one's life to it, 4 months of pre-production, 8 months of shooting with this incredible team of costumers. We had 90 full-time costumers on the whole project. Every day had to be a really important day. Every day was a day of creative costume decisions, of details. There was, so many hours of Star Wars story we were telling. It just became a marathon of costume stamina. And I think hopefully the viewers will feel like we never slacked off. And I think a real kudos to my incredible team that they were committed and engaged to telling this story in costuming in a really thorough way. And I think hopefully we'll feel that we achieved our goal.
Andor stands out because it gives you a lot more day-to-day life and sort of mundane depictions that we always get in Star Wars. And one thing is office life, like seeing Syril go to a what's a cubicle, what's an office like in Star Wars. She talked about designing costumes for things like that and making them recognizable to our eyes to be like that's what you're wearing in that setting, but also giving that little Star Wars tweak, something that's a little bit off from what we would expect.
Absolutely, yeah. I often have the words of George Lucas in my mind when I think he thought it was really important to have elements in the visual world of Star Wars that were recognizable to audiences, whether it was Tibetan culture or, World War II or African culture. There were always like little visual references from our world that would help audiences connect to these characters. They weren't way off sci-fi characters that we've never seen before out of crazy fabrics that we couldn't relate to. There was always something that we could connect with, and it made these characters compelling. It made them important, people that we could connect with, that we would care about their stories. So I always had that in the back of my head when I was creating these costumes, that they seemed grounded. They weren't ornamental. They didn't just look the way they was because I thought it would be cool. There was a reason why they looked the way they did, and we treated them as very three-dimensional, flawed, interesting human beings foremost. And that's what I tried to bring across with costuming.
And lastly, the dress uniforms that we see Krennic and some of the other characters wearing at that one gathering. Were there iterations of that? Do you think like how different should this be from our regular Krennic costume? And decide finally where you landed on.
I'm glad you noticed the dress uniform. I had a
Yeah.
lot of fun creating them. With a character like Krennic, I think my thing was like, don't mess with it too much. His iconic silhouette was so strong with his cape, his white ISB uniform. We haven't seen him also on screen for so many years. I thought it was important to like acknowledge this is his iconic look. Having said that, he does go to these formal parties, and so I thought it was important to develop a dress uniform for him for those occasions. So I made his uniform again in much richer fabrics. His cape is made out of a beautiful satin, flowy fabric. He has all of these sort of more dress uniform elements. He has the collar pips that you see, the metal sort of on his shoulders. He has a bandolier with sort of formal braid across his chest. He has dress trousers rather than the jodhpurs and the boots. He has dress trousers and formal shoes. So really thinking about the real world version of dress uniforms and what the Star Wars version of that would be and what would come across in a very confident, slick way. I think when Ben put his dress uniform on for the first time, he twirled around the fitting room and he said he felt like Elvis in his new cape. So that was a fun moment for us all.
And I bet Ben loved that he didn't have to wear gloves finally in a scene in
Yeah,
Star Wars.
indeed, yes. A villain without gloves was very groundbreaking for us. So we enjoyed that.
Michael, thank you so much and congratulations. Wonderful work on the show.
Thank you so much. Great talking with you, Eric.